Hey guys, it's Nick. There's a lot of talk about how Russia is going to default on their upcoming bond payments. Is Russia really broke and not able to pay them? Or is the US stopping bondholders from being paid by Russia? I'm going to take a look at the situation with Russia's reserves, the sanctions, how much they owe, and what might happen if their payments are not accepted for the upcoming bond interest owed. Let's take a look. So, at the start of this war, a lot of money that the Russian central bank had in other countries was frozen. So, this graphic is the last reported funds they had in June 2021. So, from 2021 to about January, the assets held by the Central Bank of Russia increased from 585 billion to 630 billion. But about 284 billion of that has been frozen by about 7 countries. I don't know what Russia was thinking by leaving this money in these countries, knowing that it was probably going to get frozen when this happened. But you see, they have about 127 billion in gold, about $80 billion in China, other international institutions, about 29 billion, and other, I don't know what that is, 62 billion. But of these frozen ones here, that comes out to 284 billion, of which 38 billion is in the US. So before the invasion, they had $38 billion in the US that they can use to pay off bonds that are due in the US in US dollars. Now, Russia was able to pay off the interest of $117 million on their $2 denominated sovereign bonds back in March. So, the reason that Russia was able to pay that interest on those bonds is because the Office of Foreign Assets Control, the OFAC, issued General License 9A, which authorizes transactions for U.S. persons with regards to the receipt of interest, dividend, or maturity payments in connection with debt or equity, basically making an exception to the sanctions where Russia could use their U.S. dollars in the U.S. to pay the interest on these bonds. But that exemption runs out on May 25th, and Russia has another about $2 billion that needs to be paid in the year 2022. So first of all, how much does Russia actually owe? Well, their external debt is something like $150 billion, and only about 45 billion of that is actually owned by the Russian government. So the government had or has 630 billion in cash. They owe themselves about 45 billion, but other companies owe also about 150 billion in external debt. And so, like Barron states in this article, Russia is being pushed towards default. So it's kind of like if you had a bank account at Chase and you had a Chase credit card, but when you tried to pay off your Chase credit card from your bank account, Chase would not let you pay the credit card and then said you are in default of your credit card balance. So now they say a $71 million payment that was due on Friday may have already been made before the U.S. authorities removed this week an exception that allowed Russia to pay its debts in dollars using currency it held outside U.S. financial institutions. But with the other payments coming due, the world will likely soon have its first case of a country that unwillingly defaults because of international sanctions rather than not having the money to pay. So if they don't pay, a default can be announced after the end of the automatic 30-day grace period. And so Russia said, well, if we can't pay our debts in dollars because of the sanctions on our bank accounts, then we're going to have to pay all our debts in rubles. But most of their bonds specify that they cannot pay in rubles, only in dollars or some other currencies. So their $71 million interest payment that was due on Friday said that the terms of the bond do not foresee payment in rubles, only in dollars, euros, pounds sterling, and Swiss francs. And what else could happen if they're said to be in default? Well, it could trigger a whole bunch of credit default swaps, which are like insurance policies against Russian debt. JP Morgan estimates that there are roughly $6 billion worth of credit default swaps that would need to be paid out. Now, that would be a big conundrum because the people that own the credit default swaps would say, yeah, Russia defaulted. But the people on the other side that would have to pay out would say, no, they didn't default because they were stopped from being able to pay or that they paid in rubles or something like that. So that could be a really big problem on who gets paid what. And so Russia's saying they're going to service their debt in rubles after the U.S. closes that loophole. And they say Russia faces an artificial situation created by an unfriendly nation. We have the money and the willingness to pay, Finance Minister Anton Siluanov said. And so Russia started transferring the money for this Friday's $100 million debt payment last week to get ahead of the new restrictions. And so they say because the funds had gone to the paying agent, its obligations on the debt were fulfilled. Bonds sold after Russia was sanctioned over its 2014 annexation of Crimea contain a provision for alternative currency payments. And for bonds listed after 2018, the ruble is listed as an alternative currency option. So some of their bonds, they actually can legally pay for them in rubles. So what's going to be the effect of other countries seeing that the U.S. can just confiscate somebody's money whenever they want? Well, here the IMF even warns that countries may cut dollar reserves in response to U.S. sanctions against Russia. And so you see already countries like Brazil, Chile, Peru, Mexico are increasing their Chinese yuan reserves at the expense of dollars, most likely. And Reuters say how sanctions against Russia could backfire. In 1935, they sanctioned Italy when Mussolini invaded Ethiopia. And they say that Mussolini's isolation on the world stage pushed him into the big H's arms. And so Germany and Japan, fearing that the economic weapon would next be deployed against them, accelerated their search for self-sufficiency in raw materials. In Germany's case, this meant pushing further into Central Europe, annexing Austria, and the big H even told a foreign diplomat in 1939 that he needed Ukraine so that Germans would never be starved again. Well, Ukraine got a lot of wheat. And Russia was sanctioned in 1917 after the Bolshevik Revolution. And they say the new regime withstood this economic siege and even used its monopoly on trade to withhold commodities from Europe. Kind of like what they're doing now, just as Russia today is keeping Ukraine wheat from reaching foreign markets. By the early 1930s, when the Soviets ceased almost all trade with the outside world, Russia's autarky was complete. And so even though Western countries have seized Russia's currency reserves, the ruble has strengthened against the US dollar. And they calculate that a European ban on imports of Russian energy would permanently lower its GDP by just 1%. And here they say Russia to reach record trade surplus, the West's financial war has failed. So The Economist magazine estimates that the Russian imports may have fallen by approximately 45%. But its exports have risen by about 8%. So they're buying less foreign stuff and selling more of their own stuff. So they're saying that estimates of the current account surplus can come in at about 250 billion in 2022. That is more than double the 120 billion that was recorded last year. So they say that the sanctions are going to increase deglobalization and drive Russia into China's camp and upend the US dollar-based financial system. And the advent of a multipolar world could result in yet more stranded assets for Western investors. This is not a desirable outcome, but a chain of events has been set in motion that may make it unavoidable. So it looks like these sanctions can make Russia's financial position even stronger, possibly. So here's a look at Russia's GDP. It's like $1.6 trillion, something along that line last year. But their debt to GDP before the pandemic was only like 12.4%. Now it's like 18%. And their gold reserves are like 2,300 tons versus the US's 8,100 tons or something. So although the US GDP is about 13 times more than Russia, their debt to GDP is about 7 times higher than Russia. And yet we only have about 4 times more gold than Russia does. So Russia doesn't seem to be in that bad of a situation, sanctions or no sanctions. So no matter your opinion on Russia or the invasion, what the US and other Western countries are doing is a slippery slope. They are arresting yachts and assets of people who they say are somehow associated with Putin or the Russian government. There's no crimes being charged against them, yet their property is being taken. This is like the police in the US that confiscate people's money without any charges because they say the money somehow came from a crime. This is similar to how Canada started freezing bank accounts of the truckers during their protest. And don't think that these are isolated incidents and that it won't happen to you or to other countries. So already countries are seeing this illegal grab of assets and wondering if they will be next because they don't agree with whatever the US says is the next big thing. This will cause countries to start moving their assets out of US dollars and euros and more into other things like maybe gold and Chinese yuan. In the long run, these tactics will hurt the US dollar and the US. Let me know in the comments if you think what the US is doing will do more harm than good to the US in the long run. I hope you like this video, and I'll see you in the next one. Thanks for watching, guys.